And whenever you're ready to go, I will go ahead and admit the 3 callers who are in the lobby, and we'll get started.
Commissioner Newborn, I'm ready if you are.
I just got ready. I have the script, so I'm ready to go. I will begin now. Good afternoon. Put my video on, I apologize. Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Public Safety Work Group. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021, due to the declared local health pandemic. For the record, my name is Tony Newborn, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Charter Commission's Public Safety Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so that we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Kozak. Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Here.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Present.
Commissioner Clegg.
Here.
Commissioner Kozak. Co-Chair Rubenstein.
Here.
Co-Chair Newborn.
Here.
There are 6 members present.
Let the record reflect we have a quorum. We will now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, LIMS, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. We will now move to the adoption of the agenda. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Moved, Perry.
Second, Sandberg.
Second, Schwarzkopf.
Great, thank you. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Kozak. Commissioner Perry.
Aye.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Aye.
Commissioner Clegg.
Aye.
Commissioner Kozak. Co-Chair Rubenstein.
Aye.
Co-Chair Newborn.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
Great. The motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Moving on to the agenda, item 1 of the agenda is the chair's report. Co-Chair Rubenstein will offer the chair's report.
Thank you, Commissioner Newborn. We have only a very brief report this week, and that is to reflect on our full commission meeting last week, at which time we presented the recommendation of this work group to adopt standards for reviewing amendments to the city charter. The full commission has not yet adopted those standards, but instead has left the matter open for people to submit any suggestions they wish to submit. So I just wanted to say that we will have another draft ready for the full commission to approve, one hopes, at our next full commission meeting. Any discussion? Hearing none, I think we can move. Oh, Commissioner Perry?
Yes. I'm wondering if amendments, is there going to be a point in where amendments will be taken to those standards?
As I understand it, Chair Clegg had invited people to make suggestions. Perhaps Chair Clegg can respond to that question. It's your
Thank
hand.
you, Commissioner Rubenstein. Yes, I asked at the meeting that anyone who had comments or suggestions just forward them to me, and anybody who wanted to join the work on those principles to contact me as well.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Perry. Any other questions or comments? Then we shall move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the interviews of invited guests to answer questions regarding public safety in the city of Minneapolis. And our invited guests, to whom we offer our most sincere appreciation and welcome, are our new city attorney, Jim Roeder, Carol Bashoon, and Bert Osborne. And City Attorney Roeder, we're going to start with you, not because we want to put you on the spot, but mostly so that we can welcome you and say hello. And also to say that if we have a number of questions for the assistant city attorneys who are here, and of course, if you would like to weigh in on any of them, your comments would be most welcome. But we do have one question for you, perhaps to set the tone for this meeting. And that is, again, understanding that you have only just begun your new position as city attorney. Have you nevertheless given thought already to what might be accomplished, your vision perhaps, to change the culture of the police department through municipal level reform? And if so, would you share that vision with us?
Well, thank you, Chair Rubenstein, and it's very good to be here. I'm very honored to be invited, and I know my team's very excited about participating today. Knowing that, I mean, as you pointed out, I am in the first day of my third week on the job. And it's been a little bit of drinking out of the fire hose. But I have had some opportunity to work particularly with Carol and Bert here to get up to speed as best I can in a fairly short period of time on the issues that you're working through. As you probably can imagine, prior to my starting at City Hall, I was a very interested observer, like any other citizen of Minneapolis, with most of my knowledge coming through media reports. That said, I do think it's relevant to point out that during my confirmation, I'm sorry, not my confirmation hearing, my public hearing before the POGO committee, I did make some remarks about how I am very personally and professionally in this role committed to working with everybody, not only within City Hall, but within the city, to achieve some significant police reform. Now, what I'm trying to learn at this point is to how best support that effort, which I think is very, I perceive from certainly what I've read in the media these past few months, that most people in the city are certainly very invested and interested in seeing some significant police reform. I'm really focused now on understanding how the Office of City Attorney can support that work. And obviously we're here today in part to do that. And I think one of the overarching themes that I've discussed with my team in terms of our role is that we need to provide the best legal and factual information and advice that we can. And that's going to be evidenced today by answering some of the questions more specifically that you have for Bert and Carol. But I want to make sure that we are not trying or allowing ourselves to wade into true political debate, which, and I don't say that with a negative connotation. I think that political debate is extremely healthy. That's part of the process. And the reason I say that is because I want to make sure that our office is very well positioned at some point once the political debate has taken its course and decisions have been made and we understand where we're going with regard to how to achieve police reform. I think it's going to be very important for our office to be in a very strong position to support that work. And just be able to support it from a place of not being judged as having been biased to one avenue of reform or another. And that would be something I'll look out for as we continue to go through this process, is so that our office is providing all the good factual and legal support we can, and then be well positioned to help the city and support the city move forward once a direction becomes clear. I hope that gives you some idea of how I've thought about this to this point on my third week of the job.
It does, and thank you
Okay.
very much.
Great.
We'll see if there are any questions before we move on. I don't see any hands up, lucky for you. So I'll turn it over to Commissioner Newborn. Co-Chair Newborn, did you want to take the next set of questions? Well, I can start. I think the next person on our agenda was Ms. Bashir. And first of all, we wanted to thank you for your memo, which we received and we've certainly reviewed today. We appreciate the legal work that you've done on it. We've had a couple of general questions that we've been working on actually in each meeting, and are very interested to hear your thoughts from the legal point of view. First question is probably the one you have spent time preparing for the most, which is, please give us your legal analysis of the proposed charter amendment offered by the City Council in terms of its consistency with existing state law and other provisions of the city charter. And specifically, is the proposal consistent with or possibly in conflict with the current state law or any other applicable laws under which the city operates? And of course, I know that you answered that question in your memo, but not everybody listening in, I think, has had a chance to read the memo.
Okay. I would like to first address whether the recommended charter provision of the City Council, whether if that was passed, whether it would conflict with any other charter provisions. I did go through the charter and determine that it would not conflict with any other charter provisions. If that charter amendment was passed, there would be no problems with any conflict of any other charter provisions. However, the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances may need to be changed. And for those that don't know the difference between the charter and the Code of Ordinances, the charter is like the Minneapolis Constitution. It's very broad-based. The ordinances are enacted to be more detailed and to provide more details about how things will be done in the city. So there are quite a few ordinances that do reference the Minneapolis Police Department. Those would have to be amended. There are other ordinances that would reference duties that a licensed peace officer will do. And if the City Council at some point determines that some duties will be done by civilians versus peace officers, then those could be changed as well. So, but the charter would be fine. There would be no problem with any conflicting charter provisions. So that relates to the charter.
I wanted to ask the question a little differently as well, which is the same question, but the fact that the City Council amendment, let's say, lacked specificity or really lacked a plan in using language like may, in reference to having a police department and so on. Does that affect your answer to this question as to whether it's conflict?
Not with respect to the charter. I just went over the remaining charter provisions. What would the remaining charter provisions after an amendment, would those be in conflict? They would not. But I can talk about the other issue, the issue of the specific charter language with respect to May. And I do talk about that in my memo, but let me just talk about that now. There is a provision in the charter amendment that says the city council may maintain a division of law enforcement services. Basically, the charter is setting forward a new department, a department of community safety and violence prevention. And within that department, there may be, according to the charter language, there may be a division of law enforcement services. Now, may is permissive. That would mean there may or may not be a division of law enforcement services. Now, that doesn't mean that there cannot be any peace officers that are doing duties that only peace officers have to do. It could mean that the city council determines that there will be a division of law enforcement services. If the city council determines that there won't be a division, they can still contract out to have others do the work. And it has to be licensed peace officers who would do the licensed peace officer work. The city could contract out with other law enforcement agencies to provide services. It could contract out with independent contractors who could provide the licensed peace officer duties. It could even do a combination of the two, have some independent contractors who do the work and also have the division. So just that language alone is not necessarily problematic. But, you know, the city, the charter commissioners can look at your standards. I know you've been working on some standards to determine how you look at different charter amendments. You can consider your standards to see what you think about the charter provision. But it is possible that the licensed peace officer work would be done by licensed peace officers, but in a different context, in a different structure.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify too, and this is obvious, but I thought it would be useful to clarify it anyway, that the memorandum that you provided to us, the legal opinion that you just provided to us, does not address part of the city council amendment. That is that part of the amendment that regarding the shifting of authority from the mayor to the city council. That was the authority issue was thoroughly addressed in the 2018 memo that was provided to the charter commissioners back in 2018 when there was a proposed amendment in play at that time. And I think that goes into quite a bit of detail on this city council function, the mayor's function with respect to the police department, and also the city council's function with respect to other departments of the city. So I would suggest that is very thorough. It's a very good memo. And I would suggest that the charter commissioners look at that memo because it goes into detail about those issues. Thank you. We certainly have.
And Madam Co-Chair, this is Casey. Sorry, just to jump in. For the public who may be watching or viewing, we did put into the chat for easier access all of those documents, but they are also posted online for public access. They're on linked and available from tonight's agenda. And as well, they are included in the research and reference file for the Charter Commission, so in multiple places.
Yes, thank you. We have Commissioner Schwarzkopf had a comment or question.
Hi, I have a question in regards to this area. The charter amendment proposed by the city council does not talk about the police department in the for the park board. Is there any conflict then? Because there will be a police department in the park board and they naturally take over policing of parks. But I don't know if they police parkways or not, if they police the boulevards or not. Those are park properties. And so is there a conflict there?
I would think there's not. I think the city council made a determination that it would not make changes to the park board. The mayor does appoint the park board police as the park board requests, but they have their own jurisdiction. And, you know, if you would want more details about that, you know, we could always have somebody come from the park board, or I could provide you more detail on that. But the park board has their own jurisdiction, and they're set up under the charter separately under Article 6 of the charter.
But the question I have though is if they do handle the enforcement of parkways, and there's no police department handling the rest of the city, is there a conflict there or not?
I would think if the park board stays within the jurisdiction of their own jurisdiction, and there should not be a conflict, and that doesn't mean necessarily there will be no peace officers on the streets. We don't know the exact details, but I guess it sounds like, Commissioner, you are making some assumptions that there won't be any peace officers available.
Well, even if there were, I don't know if there'd be any conflict or not, but I just wondered if that was a conflict. Thank you very much. I appreciate your help.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Perry?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Bashoon, I have two questions. One is elementary, but I'll get to that secondly. In the proposed amendment, there, as we've been talking about, it says there may be a Department of Law Enforcement Services. And what I'm wondering is, does that, in the way it's worded in the amendment, does that make it a charter department or not?
Are you talking about the Division of Law Enforcement or the department?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Services quarters here. And then quarter 6 allows for 6 stories in height with.
Go ahead. Were you talking about the department or the division?
I was talking about the optional department.
Okay. I looked at that issue. I did not brief it, but and what I saw that the department itself, the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, that will be a charter department because it would be listed in the charter under 7.3. Now the way, this is how I see it being set up. The director of that department will be an officer under the charter, because that person will be appointed under 8.1, hold on, 8.2, wait, I forget what it is. That person will be appointed under the charter to be an officer. They will be, so that person will have a 2-year term probably, because under the charter, officers generally have a 2-year term. So that's what will happen with the director. With respect to the division head, there will be a director of the division if the division is in place. That individual will not necessarily be an officer. 8.1 of the charter specifies and defines what an officer is. I don't think that division director would be an officer, which would mean they would not have a set term. Now, that would mean they would be one of two things. They would either be they would be an employee in the classified service or the unclassified service. According to the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, the city council can set out the appointed positions in the city, which means those are at-will positions. And that's done, if you want to look at that at some point, the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, section 20.1010 and 20.40. Now, those provisions lay out the requirements to be in an appointed position and also how those appointed positions are set up by the city council. Basically, the city council would have to do an action to make that basically an appointed position. So it's not in the classified services. So that would mean there would be no term limit on that. It would basically be an at-will position. So the Charter Commission can consider that. The director will be a 2-year term, and the head of the division will generally be an at-will employee.
Okay, and so the basic question is, in terms of what we're talking about here, what is the benefit of being a charter department versus a division head?
I don't know if there's any specific. I mean, that person is in charge of the department. They're the ultimate person on the organizational chart who are they're in charge. And just like any other department, there might be divisions. You know, the large departments, Department of Public Works, they have divisions. Ultimately, they are responsible up to the head of that department. So, I mean, that would be the main gist of it, I would assume.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Kozak?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Carol, Ms. Bashoon, I have 2 questions. And I'm sorry if maybe they've been answered already, or you may have answered them a long time ago, since this all started back in June. The provision, the .0017 provision in the charter, that's the centerpiece of the controversy. Does that include all police department employees, or does that specifically apply to the sworn officers? What's the I guess would be the denominator of that fraction?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we have an exact answer at this time. There have been some prior city attorney opinions that have looked at that issue. The charter has changed over time. I don't know if it's exactly clear whether it would be only sworn or the entire department. At this point, I don't think the city attorney's office has made an exact determination on that because it's not completely clear in the charter.
Oh, okay. Well, let's assume, and I've read it about 3 or 4 times, and your guess is better than mine probably, but let's assume for the moment that it's ruled someone goes to court and the court rules that in fact it applies to sworn personnel. As many of the members here, and I'm sure you saw it, the letter we got from Mr. Michaels last week that Casey sent out to us talks about where we rank in where the city ranks officers and employees per 1,000, and I think we're like number 53 for cities that are 250,000 and above. But if that fraction 0.0017 if that fraction is applied to all police employees, we're well above that. However, given what's happened since June, and we're down, according to some estimates, we're down around 750 of those sworn officers. We're getting pretty close to that number, if in fact that is that's the denominator of the fraction. So if that were to occur, if we got below that, what's the remedy? If it's a violation of the charter, what is there a remedy? Or someone have to go to court?
Well,
court orders the city hire more cops or what?
I can say that we are in litigation right now on this very issue. There is litigation related to the funding provision in the charter and whether the city is in compliance with that charter provision. I would like to advise the Charter Commission that the charter provision does state that when we are talking about population, we are talking about the last decennial census. I want to say it's in 1.3, but you can check that out. So presumably, when we are looking at the population under that funding provision, the population would be based on the city's population based on the 2010 census. So if you recall, it was something like, what, 385,000.
Yep.
So that is the number that we use, the population number, and that's my interpretation. That's the population number we would use to multiply that times the 0.0017. Now, whether we multiply that by, whether we compare that to sworn or the entire department, I can't give you an exact answer at this point. Mm-hmm. But I would suggest that you do look at that terminology in the charter provision.
I will, thank you. Yeah, right now, if it were the 385 or whatever it was, the city would certainly be in compliance with the charter. But next year, once we get the data, that's all going to have to be recalculated. And the lawsuit you're talking about is the one that was filed a month or so ago from the neighborhoods up in the north side, and I think Phillips. Is that the one we're talking about?
I think it's Kathy Spann. There are some other individuals. Yeah, it was filed, I don't know, a few weeks ago. I just wanted to add one more thing. The charter provision talks about funding. It doesn't talk about at any point in time, like today or tomorrow, what's our staff level. It talks about the funding for the department. Or the funding for the individuals to which it applies, the sworn or the department. So I wanted to let you know about that also, because the funding is done through generally the budgetary or appropriation process. And so that's what the provision relates to. So I wanted to make it clear that provision relates to funding.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very helpful. Appreciate it.
Sorry. Okay. I had just a couple of follow-up questions from those questions that Commissioner Perry and Commissioner Kozak has asked. And one with respect to Commissioner Perry's question is, do we actually need a charter provision to create the new department as proposed in the City Council amendment? And I ask that because Section 7.2A15 provides that the City Council can establish or provide for any other department necessary to the city. Doesn't that provision already give the City Council authority to create the department it has proposed?
I would have to look at that in more detail, but if the City Council intends to change the scheme of the current charter, like the scheme of government, and they want a more holistic department that will oversee public safety, and they want the sworn officers to be a division or a part of that, but they want more of a holistic department. Then it would make sense to change the charter to change how the structure is set up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And my other question was simply, Commissioner Kozak referred to the letter that we received from Jim Michaels last week, and I wondered if either of you had a chance to look at it, and if so, you had any comments about it.
I did not get a copy of that letter, so I cannot comment on it.
That's my fault, Madam Chair. I was just going to interrupt and say I failed to forward that to the attorney's office, only to the commissioners. I have since forwarded it just now to Ms. Bashoon.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all right. Are there any, Chair Clegg has a question.
Not really a question, just a comment. My own view is that the city council can establish or disestablish non-charter departments as it chooses to do so at will. And the only difference is that a non-charter department can be disbanded by the city council, and a charter department can only be disbanded by amendment of the charter.
Right. Thank you. Commissioner Kozak?
Just a comment to follow up with Commissioner Clegg, that in reality, I agree with him that having a new department as part of the charter means that it has to stay until the charter is changed. That some council can't come along and by fiat eliminate the department. On the other hand, as we have seen, the council, irrespective of the charter, can, with the power of the purse, can reorganize as a practical matter and really do pretty much whatever they want. For example, they could shift a whole bunch of stuff consistent with the 0.0017 funding requirement, but they can shift a whole bunch of things over to the division within the health department of the violence prevention and have basically the same effect. It might not be as elegant, but as a practical matter, the council has enormous discretion about how to structure law enforcement. Charter makes it maybe easier, but they can do, if they have the determination, they can do pretty much what they want.
Thank you. Are there any other hands up? Chair Clegg?
Just by way of example, when we were rewriting the charter to put it in plain language, we discovered an orphan department in the charter. I believe it was called the Department of Industry and something or other. But the last time it had been referred to in any council proceedings had been the 1960s, yet it was still a charter department until we got rid of it. So just because it's in the charter doesn't necessarily mean it's funded or anybody pays any attention to it.
Oh, true. Commissioner Ginder?
Thank you. I was just going to reiterate, apparently it's already been said by a couple of the commissioners, is that the council's ability to create departments is pretty much unlimited, and they've done that in the past, whether the Department of Communications or any other number of departments. So they do have that power. And then just with regard to the question that was raised earlier about the difference between a charter department head and a non-charter department head, which was a question I addressed when I worked at the city attorney's office, is that there really is none other than the greater prestige of being named in the charter. But that's about the sole limitation between the department heads from charter or non-charter.
Thank you, Commissioner Ginder. Are there any other hands up? I wanted to ask you, Ms. Bashoon, about page 7 in your memo, when you were discussing the city council authority over the police department. understanding that that was more thoroughly addressed in 2018 when we were looking at that question then. But you mentioned in your memo that that 2018 memo provided that the city council has the same authority over the police department as it does over all city departments. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And specifically, could the city council, say, pass an ordinance that defines or limits police functions? Or if it's the same as other departments, are there the same limitations as well?
Well, with respect to generally what the city council can do with respect to other departments, it's the same thing. The departments kind of control themselves, but the city council can set policies and goals. They often have staff come forward to provide updates. They can do a lot of staff direction to departments, but the departments are generally running themselves, and that's what I was talking about. That was in the summary of the 2018 memo. With respect to the duties, the specific duties that the city council has over the police department and the mayor has over the police department, I think that memo is very detailed. It goes over, what the city council can do and what the mayor can do. I know the city council, they have the ability to fund the police department. That's a big option for them to determine how they're going to fund it. Of course, with the current provision in the charter, they have to follow that funding provision in the charter. But that's one of the main things that the city council can do with respect to the police department. They can decide how many officers are we going to fund in the police department. So that's a huge option for the city council to decide how they're going to fund the police department and how many officers there will be. So that's one way that the city council can be very involved. You can look at the memo, though. It goes into a lot of detail. The mayor has a lot of authority, has much authority over the police department as it stands now. So those are the main issues. And if, Jim or Bert want to talk about that any further, I'll let them do so later or at any time.
Is there anything either of you would like to add?
Not of any import, Madam Chair.
Thanks. Thank
Not
you.
at the moment.
One more question for Ms. Bashoon, although again, this may be for any of you. From your perspective, are there barriers or obstacles in the current charter that would affect police reform and accountability? And are there opportunities for interdepartmental partnerships and alternatives to public safety service delivery in the charter?
So I wanted to address some of, some of the options. As I talked about, the city could still contract out for police services if it wanted to. There are some good and bad things about that. One is that they would not have to have maybe as large of a police force or as many licensed peace officers who work for the city. They could contract out and have some of that work done by outside contractors. However, the issues with that would be that the city may not be the priority of that contractor. Say, for example, if we contract with Hennepin County to do some of the law enforcement work for the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County may have other priorities at any given time. So we have to consider that. We also generally, when cities contract out with other cities or counties, the assisting county or city, they would follow their own procedures and policies for that law enforcement agency. So if the city wanted to contract out with, say, St. Paul would follow their own processes and their own policies, which would mean that the city wouldn't have a lot of input into how they did their work. Now, it's true that the city could decide who we're going to contract with and who we're not going to contract with based on their policies and procedures. However, again, we still have the issue of prioritizing. If something happens in St. Paul and St. Paul has to attend to that, they will not be able to necessarily provide services to the city of Minneapolis or the services that we may need at the time. So contracting out is an option, and I wanted to bring that up. Also, there is a provision in the law that allows us to contract if there's an emergency. Again, that law, and I'll state it for the public, it's Minnesota Statutes Section 12.331. That law allows this city to contract with other political subdivisions, other cities. However, that law also says that, you know, they don't have to give us services if they don't want to. So if there's a regional or a metro emergency, the city of Minneapolis, if we don't have enough officers, we may not be able to get all the police force that we need because those other entities might be busy and using those officers for their own purposes. So those are just some of the issues with contracting out. It's an option and there are pros and cons with that. Also, you know, the city can always look at, or the Charter Commission can also look at what are other cities doing? What kind of funding do other cities have? How is that working? What programs are working? There are a lot of programs that could be done in the city, and it sounds like a lot of those programs are being done by the police department at this time. You had Deputy Chief Eric Force talk about that, I think, last week at this work group, and he mentioned a lot of different programs that have been put in place for the last 5 years, and some of them do track with the United States Conference of Mayors report. So there are options for new programs and new pilots. There are all kinds of options available for this new overarching department if this department is created. I don't know if you have any other questions on that, but there are quite a few options, and also we do have right now the Office of Violence Prevention. That's in the, or it's not an office, it's in the health department, and the Office of Violence Prevention, they are now working on new programs, and they could be working with the police department to provide this holistic form of community policing. And that could continue even with it could change a little bit with the new department. So the new department would be the overarching department. They could be dealing with the holistic viewpoint, and they could be working with the Division of Law Enforcement Services to do this kind of work, to find co-responder programs, to try new ones out, to expand those, to look at other programs. So those are some options that are available.
Thank you. I found your discussion in your memo and today very thought-provoking. I think it gives us a lot to consider, and thank you for it. Sort of a small question I had related to the interagency agreements was whether, you know, such as the ones with St. Paul and with the Hennepin County Sheriff, do those refer only to licensed police officers? or is it more open-ended?
Well, I know that a lot of our interagency agreements, they are, we do have agreements with like Hennepin County and some of the other cities. So, and we do also set up agreements for certain things, like if there's a Republican National Convention here or other events where we might need police forces from other cities. We will have contracts for those. The city can contract out with anybody they want through our contracting process. The city has a very robust contracting process. So we can follow that to contract out for, say, civilian type of services. If we wanted to contract out with social workers or people who are psychologists or psychiatrists or other individuals who are good with organizing, those are all the possibilities. We can always contract with others. So we don't necessarily need, the interagency agreements that I've been talking about are basically peace officers assisting other peace officers, but we can always contract with others to provide services under this new department or under the new division.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question for, I think, both you and Mr. Osborne. From your perspective, again, are there improvements or changes to the current charter other than the amendment now before us, that would help to advance or support police reform and accountability? Or are there opportunities in possible charter language that would expand into departmental partnerships or alternatives to public safety service delivery?
I can say I read through the entire charter just recently to make sure that the new charter provision would not conflict with other charter language if it was passed. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. That's really more, I think the Charter Commission can think about that, because I know the Charter Commission is considering whether in the future you will be proposing your own amendments. And that would be, that would be a great time for you to consider that, look at all the charter provisions and see if there's something that you could come up with collectively with all of your bright minds to maybe put some language in the charter that will be great for public safety or anything else. So just keep in mind that the charter is very broad. And so once you have the department or the division, there's a lot that can be done within that department or division. And that's something that the city of Minneapolis can consider. They can look at how do we want this department to be run? How do we want the division to be run? What kind of programs are we going to put into this department or division? Where are we going to focus our funding? So there's all kinds of options there that the city council could have under these current charter provisions, and the Charter Commission can consider, what kind of charter provisions would you come up with if the Charter Commission were to be proposing its own amendments to the charter.
So you mean we better do our homework? Okay, thank you. I think Commissioner Newborn was going to take over some questions if you're available. Not sure. Oh, well, I'll keep going until she
might be on mute.
Okay. She is. Well, I'll ask the next one until she's ready. This is for Mr. Osborne. It's your turn.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Again, we also received a very helpful memo from you, but we wanted to ask you to summarize your analysis of those duties which by law must be performed by a licensed peace officer, and how those legal mandates relate to the Minneapolis Police Department.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you all again. And yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, when I started looking at what in state statutes must be performed, must be done by a licensed peace officer, it would have been made this task much easier if there was a comprehensive list in state statutes setting that forth. And you know what I discovered is there isn't. The gold standard of statutory construction in this area exists in just a couple places. For instance, there's a statute 626.862 that reads, only a peace officer and part-time peace officer may, and then it lists three things: issue a citation in lieu of arrest or continued detention, ask a person receiving a citation to give a written promise to appear in court, or take a person into custody as permitted by section 629.34. So that's one of the few statutes that actually sets forth in pretty clear terms that only a peace officer can take those actions. Now, I will say that the profession of law enforcement and peace officers in Minnesota is heavily regulated. There's a couple hundred at least references in state law. And, you know, I think based on when statutes might be drafted, there's, you know, they're variously referred to as peace officers, officers, law enforcement officers, police officers, licensed peace officers. And, you know, I didn't find anything that would lead me to believe that all of those things weren't referring to the same thing. But it's this kind of tangled bowl of spaghetti of regulations contained in state law in many different places. I have to publicly thank the police department and Lieutenant Chris Hildreth, who I think he searched every single state statute to find various terms, and I found some of his research to be very useful and helpful in this task. But the question, I think, you know, we talk about in the memo that we sent, we talk briefly about the concept of preemption. You know, has the state so occupied this field of regulation that others can't do it, or conflicting regulations at the local level might be preempted by state law? You know, I have a hard time viewing preemption as a real barrier to police reform, because, you know, you know, Deputy Chief Forrest can hop in here anytime too, but there are already many different types of civilian employees who work directly with licensed peace officers and are part of law enforcement that, you know, work in conjunction with licensed peace officers. We already have that. That's not a new thing. And so, you know, I think that, you know, that tells me anyway, and I hope others, that, you know, there's more opportunities to rethink how public safety works in the city, and we're not necessarily preempting what the legislature wants its peace officers to do. Many of the requirements and rules contained in state statutes regarding peace officers, they come in the form of what a peace officer must do if they come upon a certain situation. Many reporting requirements. You know, if a peace officer, you know, finds A, B, or C, they have to send reports to this agency, that agency, and the post board, you know, for instance. It doesn't say anything about others not being able to take those reports or make those reports to certain agencies, but you know, the many places in state statute that refer to what peace officers do, how they're licensed, how they enforce the laws, talk specifically about what a peace officer must do to make sure that the wheels of the criminal justice system and the reporting and the policies of the legislature are carried out. And so, is there a lot in state law or that says others can't do that? No, but a preemption challenge is always an issue. Now, again, I say and I point out, we have SAFE officers, we have civilian specialists in the crime lab working with law enforcement, others already, working hand in glove with licensed peace officers. And so, I again am skeptical of the notion that that can't be developed further. We point out a few considerations in our memo that our criminal division was not concerned about, just wanted to point out for anybody thinking about police reform and what licensed peace officers do and what others might do. A few considerations include the Brady rules pertaining to what must be disclosed to criminal defendants and their attorneys in a criminal prosecution. It goes to the credibility in the past of mostly police officers, but I think it would apply to any agent of the state, any tool of the state used in criminal prosecutions. That is not an insurmountable barrier. I think there's, I think like Carol pointed out, I think we very much envision licensed peace officers still continuing to have a role in public safety in the city. And so, I think to the extent that there needs to be a law enforcement agency, a lot of some post rules and other statutes require certain things to happen under the umbrella and under the authority of a law enforcement agency, under the authority of a chief law enforcement officer, Chief Rondo, in our case. And so, but I again don't view those as necessarily as barriers at all to rethinking how we might do some of this work.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, I'll stand for questions at that point.
Are there any questions?
I have a follow-up question. I'm back on. I hope that you all can hear me. Attorney Osborne, first of all, I love the hot sauce selection that you have in your kitchen. It's very nice. I need to come over and taste each one of them. But second, I think you got to the question that we had that we sent out to you all, which is, question number 6, because you were talking a bit about the barriers. And so I'll just read it, but I think you've talked a little bit about this, and if you can expand upon it, or Attorney Bashoon, good to see you as well. And the question reads, separate from the charter, what examples can you provide of existing state or local laws, policies, regulations, et cetera, are barriers or obstacles to police reform and accountability, opportunities for interdepartmental partnerships and alternatives to public safety service delivery? I know that's a loaded question, but you started to go a bit down the road of alternatives.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Madam Chair. Through the chairs, and Ms. Bashoon already responded to some of that, but just from my perspective, I don't think there's any barriers in the charter to police reform. I think the charter should be, as Carol pointed out, Ms. Bashoon pointed out, a very high level structure of your local government. Departments working together and divisions working together, and all of us helping to accomplish the city's goals. that is very much incumbent on the goodwill of the department heads and who the executive committee and the mayor and the city council put in positions of leadership. That all comes down to people. I don't envision a lot of structure that could be put in the charter that would, magically make departments work together or find some synergies. Maybe I'm not the most creative person in the world, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But I don't think there's any barriers in our current charter to reforming any part of our local government or how it does business.
Okay, and I apologize for that. I was having some technical issues, so sorry about that, Attorney Bashun, if we've already addressed that issue. Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, it's Casey. Maybe I could emphasize or redirect the two attorneys in a different direction. The question is very long, and they've both addressed that the charter doesn't propose or present necessary obstacles, but part of the question did say, what about state laws and things above the charter?
Great, thank you for that.
I did not cover one issue that I covered in my memo. It's the state law related to, it's called the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, USERRA. And that only comes into play if if the new charter provision, which sets out the qualifications of the new director of this new department, if that's interpreted in a certain way. The charter provision itself, as it reads, is fine. It requires that that director have at a minimum some non-law enforcement experience in community safety services, including but not limited to public health and or restorative justice approaches. The state law may put a wrinkle in that if the city wants to interpret that to mean that if somebody has some law enforcement experience in their background, they cannot apply for the position. And that is because some of the armed force prior employees or even current employees, they may have some law enforcement experience in their background through their work as maybe a reservist or prior work with the armed forces. So to just exclude those individuals who have the armed force experience in law enforcement, to exclude them from the application process could be a violation of USERRA. So I just wanted to bring that up. There could potentially be some equal protection arguments if in fact, we're treating people with law enforcement experience different than people without law enforcement experience. There has to be a rational basis for making that determination and deciding that we're going to make that distinction when we're looking at the, when we're looking at applications and the qualifications of individuals for the director position. So that's something for the city council or the city and human resources to consider when they're looking at this charter language. We just have to be careful that we're staying within the law and we're considering the qualifications and making decisions based on the law. So that would be one thing that we just have to think about, at least the city and human resources when they're actually choosing somebody from that director position. But technically, as the language stands in the charter amendment, there's no problem with that language. It's just the application of it that could go a little bit awry if the constitutional provisions and the state law is not, and the federal law is not followed.
Madam Chair, I want to respect what the clerk has brought up in terms of the question. I think it also referred to some state law potential. And again, this is the beginning of my third week on the job. So with the caveat that I know just enough to be dangerous, I think it's relevant to at least point out that there's a Public Employee Relations Act that Minnesota has that essentially would ensure that we have a collective bargaining relationship and obligation with the existing police force. And that doesn't go away if for some reason you had a charter amendment like this pass. So that is something that would have to be considered and certainly be relevant as we continue to deal with the Police Federation on terms and conditions of their employment. That's I want to make sure we point that out because I think it's a very relevant. I'm not saying it's an obstacle or some sort of problem, but it's a very real obligation that would not disappear just by a change in the city charter.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the clarification and also the follow-up both by you, Ms. Bashun and Attorney Williams. Sorry, it looks like Chair Clegg has his hand raised.
Thank you, and I just wanted to also thank Assistant City Attorney Bashun, because I note that she also did refer to the labor issues in her memorandum and the opinion we received several weeks ago concerning the City of Brainerd, the firefighters versus the City of Brainerd case. So that's in there as well. And the fact that you're not referring to it now is fine. I just wanted to note for the record that we do have it in our file and was provided to us several weeks ago. Thank you.
Chair Rubenstein, do I have the next question? I want to make sure that I'm keeping us on track.
Yes, please.
Could you remind me which question that we're on so I don't do a repeat?
I think actually number 7, which is a follow-up to what Chair Clegg just said.
Oh, perfect. So speaking of the Brainerd lawsuit, if the Brainerd lawsuit concerning its attempt to eliminate its fire department was upheld in court for about 4 years, approximately how many years do you estimate a proposal to eliminate the Minneapolis Police Department would be in court? Second part of this question is, or would the court's judgment in the Brainerd's case be applicable to Minneapolis? And would that expedite a decision being made for action by Minneapolis?
I can, excuse me, I can say that the Brainerd case related to a very small fire department that was eliminated. The specific facts of that case was that the city, thought about eliminating the fire department and making them into volunteer firefighters. And then they decided that they weren't going to do that. Then they went into the negotiations with the union, entered into union contract. And after they entered into the union contract, they then decided, okay, we will get rid of the fire department. So they already had a union contract for years. And then that's when they decided they were going to get rid of the fire department. And they wanted to get rid of the entire fire department. So there would be there would no longer be a fire department, and they would use volunteers. So in that case, one of the things I will say is that the city of Brainerd did admit that they used the language of the provision in PELRA, saying that they did do what was in the language of PELRA, which is they did, I can't remember the exact language, but they kind of admitted to the language that would be a violation, but they said they had a reason for doing it. They wanted to have this other department where it would be volunteer firefighters. So they said, and they had other reasons for doing it. But that may not be the case with the city of Minneapolis. We don't know what will happen. We don't know what a division of peace officers would look like. We don't know if it we don't know how many people would be in the department. We don't know how long it would take before we have the division set up. I can tell you that the Human Resources Department has worked on issues like this in the past where there's been a changeover in divisions or departments, and they have worked through some of these issues. So it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be in litigation on all of these issues, or we're going to be in the Brainerd type of area where we're getting rid of every single police officer. So we don't know what will happen. We don't, that Brainerd case may not be applicable to us, but we do have to look out for that Brainerd case. We have to look out for that Brainerd case. We don't know how it would apply. What if you remove a larger percentage of the police officers from the city versus not having any peace officers with the city? We don't know how that Brainerd case will be applied to the city of Minneapolis when it takes its actions, and quite honestly, we don't know exactly what the new division of law enforcement services will look like at this time. But as the new city attorney, Jim Router, has stated, we do have to watch out for those issues. We do have a union contract with the Peace Officer Federation of Minneapolis. They represent the sworn officers. We do have PELRA, which is the law that relates to employer relations with the union employees. So we do have to watch those issues. With respect to litigation, there could always be litigation. The city of Minneapolis is always at the forefront. When we have new programs, we were the first in Minnesota to have ranked choice voting. We were in litigation on that. So could there be litigation? There could always be litigation. How long would it take? I can't estimate that, but the city has determined to make policies over the years based on what the city determines to be the best in its interest. And if there's litigation that occurs after that, the city has always been the city attorney's office has been available to assist the city with those issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Assistant Attorney Bashoon. I believe Commissioner Garcia had her hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is related to changes in the collective bargaining agreement for the police department. A little bit of context. While I know there is a lot of discussion back and forth about residency requirements, perhaps one idea may be to require police officers, especially those who don't live in the city of Minneapolis, to do some kind of community volunteering work. Perhaps they coach Little League, perhaps they help out at, the Northside Arts Flow, or different neighborhood events. Number one, is that something that would go into the collective bargaining agreement? And number two, I feel like a kid in a candy store, so I'm gonna take this moment. How are changes to the collective, or proposals to the collective bargaining agreement made?
Jim?
Well, so if you're not familiar with my background, Commissioner, I started out as a lawyer many years ago as an attorney for the National Labor Relations Board in Detroit.
Wow.
Well, I don't know about wow, but so what that makes me is a very experienced private sector labor attorney.
Right.
There are things that I am still learning in this new role in the public sector. But there are a lot of things that are similar. And so I think, first off, what I would say is what you're describing, particularly if we're trying, if in your scenario, that was a required duty, so to speak, of these sworn peace officers covered by this collective bargaining agreement, that would be a negotiable item that we would have to work through with the Police Federation. because, and plus you described it as a volunteer activity. That's a term and condition of employment that would entail them spending otherwise compensable time, I guess, in an uncompensated fashion. I'm not going to try to opine right now off the cuff about whether that would be completely legal if we even reach that agreement with the Federation, but we certainly would have to bargain over that. I don't think there's any question. I don't think that's something that would fall into a management rights policy arena, given the fact that you're talking about specifically their time spent in the duties of being a sworn peace officer.
I guess it would be something that would be part of their paid time. So while it's technically not, volunteer, the concept is just relationship with the community and building trust.
Absolutely, I understand your concept. I'm just trying to make sure you understand. I am fairly certain that would be a mandatory subject to bargaining with the Federation.
Would there be any other way to promote that, or?
There's other ways you could come at that with regard to maybe providing incentives to engage in certain activities. And depending on how you structured the incentives, it may or may not be a mandatory subject to bargaining. I don't want to go too far down the path of, dealing in a lot of, vague what ifs, but as those types of ideas were developed and we got more specificity around the facts and how things would be set forth, then we'd be able to bring more clarity to, well, what's our legal obligation with regard to how to manage through that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great. Do we have other questions? Commissioner Kozak?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to follow up on what Commissioner Garcia, her question, we did have residency requirement in Minneapolis for probably about 6 years, maybe from 93, I think, until it was repealed in 99. But state law now preempts the city from unilaterally doing it. I haven't looked at the law, and I wouldn't know that I would be interpreting it properly. I assume you could collectively bargain for some kind of residency or some kind of volunteer activity, as Commissioner Garcia suggests, but I don't know that. You'd have to look at the law, which preempts local residency requirements. However, they did, I don't think anyone's mentioned, when they passed the police reform bill during the second or third special session this year, they did explicitly permit the cities to offer incentives for that kind of activity, for residency, which I assume would apply also to some of the things that have been discussed here. But it would be a major undertaking. Residency was very difficult. The police obviously didn't like it, but the ones that really affected the politics, there were the teachers in AFSCME. They were violently opposed to it, and then when politics changed in 1970, after the 78 election, it was doomed. And I think it would be very difficult to get it passed. But they did do the incentives, which I think was a big plus.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I believe we have a question. I can't see from whom, though.
Commissioner Abbott.
Commissioner Abbott. Okay, great. Commissioner Abbott?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the collective bargaining element here. The question I have is, and I suspect the answer is no, but I think we should raise the issue, which is there any special status to a charter amendment when it comes to negotiating over terms and conditions of employment? in the sense of, obviously you go into every bargaining session with, you've got a list of things you want, the other side has a list of things they want. But I'm just wondering, like, if a charter amendment gets passed and if the city goes into a negotiating session saying, well, we can't move on this because it's part of the charter, or if in fact the voters have enacted it through the charter, we've got a popular mandate for this. Does that change, any analysis when it comes to say whether the city might be bargaining in bad faith if they insist on that provision down the road? Or just generally, does the fact that does any kind of element of the charter have any kind of effect on how a court is going to look at possible labor violations?
Well, and Carol and Bert can certainly chime in, but as I've tried to get quickly up to speed on the public sector labor law issues that are relevant here. If I'm not mistaken, Minnesota statute, the Public Employee Relations statute, is pretty clear that a city could not really amend its charter in a fashion that would avoid its obligations under that statute. And so there's really no way through a charter change to relieve ourselves of the duty to, for instance, bargain over terms and conditions of employment. Carol, Bert, I don't know if you have more to add there. That's high level. That's my pretty clear understanding of the Public Employee Relations statute.
Yeah, I can chime in because I did some litigation on something that related to this provision. The Minnesota statutes, section 179.8.20, subdivision 2, that talks about how we treat collective bargaining agreements as they relate to the laws of Minnesota and Minnesota charters and ordinances. So no provision of a contract, a collective bargaining agreement can be in conflict with municipal charters. But the charters have to be consistent with Chapter 179. Chapter 179 talks about collective bargaining. So in other words, the basic terms that need to be bargained for, they would be bargained for in the collective bargaining agreements. But if it's something else that the Minneapolis charter provides, then the contract cannot be in conflict with the charter. So for instance, how the city is set up, if it's set up with a division of community safety, and then it has a division of the police department, that's not something that's under Chapter 179. That's not a requirement in a collective bargaining agreement. That's not something that is specifically supposed to be bargained for. So I think that the charter would override the collective bargaining agreement. Now, if we tried to put in the collective bargaining agreement that everybody gets paid $15 an hour no matter what, that would be problematic because wages would be a typical thing that should be bargained for under a collective bargaining agreement. And if we put that in the charter, that might be problematic. So I think the charter provision, if we put a new department in there, as the proposed charter amendment would be, that would not conflict with the collective bargaining agreement.
I guess that's excellent. I appreciate that. I was thinking more along the lines of, suppose we were to pass a charter amendment that would, specifically implement like de-escalation strategies or ban warrior training or otherwise govern the conduct of a peace officer, which seems to me that's kind of the immovable force and the irresistible object in the sense that you have, I think I just mixed those two. Let's just mix that metaphor up. But you have, clearly that's an element of how a peace officer is going to conduct his or her employment. And then to put that in, that's obviously a subject of collective bargaining. And yet to put it, I mean, so my question is, do we get any kind of special sauce or special status for, you know, terms and conditions of employment if the city as a whole, through its citizens in a general referendum, you know, enact a policy of the kind?
Well,
I would, oh, go ahead, Jim.
well, I was just going to say, to provide some clarification without getting too into the weeds, some of the examples you've just brought up are actually not necessarily mandatory terms that need to be bargained for. They're actually within the management rights policy clause of the collective bargaining agreement. And I think your warrior training example, if I'm not mistaken, would squarely fall into the management rights policy domain. Terms and conditions of employment tend to go more specifically to, you know, straightforward things like wages, benefits, disciplinary rules, that type of thing. Carol, what do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, that we'd have to determine what's like an inherent management right, like a general policy on how things are run versus a term and condition. So if we were looking at those types of charter provisions, we would have to look at that. Is that an inherent management right? Or is that something that you have to bargain for as a term and condition of employment? And we could look at the terms in the statute. It lays out what's a term and condition, but there might be gray areas. There's a lot of case law on what's a term and condition and what's not. If like I said, if it's something like a wage, that would be clearly a term and condition. If it's like a management policy, it may not be a term and condition. It may be an inherent management policy or decision. So I think there's a spectrum, and there's some things clear at one end and clear at the other, but there's a little bit of gray area. So we'd always have to look at those issues. But I agree with what Jim said.
Can I just briefly hop in? Commissioner, Madam Chairs and Commissioners, you know, if it truly would be an inherent managerial right, you know, I would hesitate to put it in the charter. You know, I think the charter, you know, once that is in, something is in the charter, you know, we all know that's, you know, that's a permanent part of our city's constitution, and very difficult to change. So, you know, beyond setting up a new Department of Public Safety or, you know, changing the current references in the charter to the police department, you know, if something is an inherent managerial right and does not need to be bargained, you know, I would hesitate to put that into the charter. That's just my humble opinion.
Okay, I appreciate the feedback here. It's been very helpful. I mean, obviously, one of the issues we're dealing with is, you know, how necessary is a charter amendment to accomplish certain goals that the council has laid out, and I think this really kind of cuts to the core issue. And as I read your answer, it seems to me that the fact that something may be a charter provision or not be a charter provision really doesn't give it any kind of special status. It's just a question of how it fits into the existing categories of labor law. So
I think that's accurate.
And I would agree with Bert. And you can see the Minneapolis Police Department has changed its use of force policy on a couple occasions and fairly quickly in response to events that have occurred. And it makes sense that you should be able to quickly change things up if they're not working. And if you put it in the charter, you can't change that up quickly.
Thank you very much. That was a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Great. I think Commissioner Ginder, you have a question?
Well, not so much a question, it's kind of, I think, a further explanation of some of the questions that have been going on here. So, for example, when you talk about management rights, the city, putting aside the charter requirement right now, the city could decide that we only want to fund 500 police officers or 400 police officers. That's a management right. The city could say, we want to have 4 divisions, a patrol division and this division and this division. That's a management right. Most policy decisions are going to be management rights. But for example, when the city decided that they wanted to put in cameras in every squad car, we argued that was a management right, but the implementation of that management right became a subject of bargaining. Okay, under what circumstances was it going to be turned on? How long could it be turned off? So the policies can be enacted, but sometimes the implementation of those policies also becomes more complicated and may fall into a bargaining aspect of that. So it's a very sometimes complex decision or matter trying to figure out whether it's where the line is between a pure policy or management right and a subject of mandatory bargaining. And one other thing I just wanted to kind of go along in this vein is when we talk about some of the state law prohibitions or impediments to change. You know, we talk about PELRA a lot, especially like in terms of when you want to terminate an officer or discipline an officer. PELRA isn't the only impediment we have in these kind of areas. So for example, the Veterans Preference Act, you know, we can go ahead and convince the state legislature to change how maybe a special exemption for police officers and how arbitration works for police officers, but they have the option of not going through PELRA. They also have the option, if they're former military, in which police officers are a significant percentage of those are former military, they can go through the Veterans Preference Act, which has a similar just cause standard. And so it's every time you remove one impediment, you have to look, there may be another impediment behind you as far as you go forward. And that falls into the hiring process. So if the city wants to move into a new law enforcement division, well, when they go out for applicants and putting aside the city's own policies about hiring people, they're going to go into it and say, well, we've got veterans preference points. So when we want to hire this new law enforcement thing, every one of those veterans starts out 5 points up on the scale. And one can have a significant argument about whether or not veterans are actually the best candidates for police officers. And yes, they have a lot of experience, but does that experience translate equitably into what you're trying to do in law enforcement in a city? So it's just kind of some comments there as you wander through these decisions.
Great, thank you so much, Commissioner Ginder. I believe that Commissioner Metke has a question. Commissioner?
Yep, sorry, I was trying to unmute and it kept muting me back up. So
No worries.
you might have answered this, but I'm just going to throw it out there anyway. I hear a lot of conversation about law enforcement, and another part of policing is community policing, which kind of goes back to what Commissioner Garcia was asking about, kind of goes back to what Commissioner Ginder was just talking about. Could community policing be a standalone point in a bargaining agreement? And then you could build in some of the community outreach and community engagement types of activities and not just have it be law enforcement. So I don't know if it's a question or just a comment, but I just wanted to throw it out there because it is separate than law enforcement by the U.S. Department of Justice. They look at community policing and law enforcement as two separate things and two separate strategies. So just throwing it out there.
Great, thank you so much, Commissioner Metke. Do we have any responses to that for our panel?
I think that right now is just part of the structure of the police department. The police department determines where it's best to place its officers. And I think they recently did make some changes and they moved the structure around a little bit. And I think they may not be working with PAL and some other of these community organizations at this point. But typically that is something that may be more of a management right to determine where you're going to put your force and what kind of exact duties they're going to be performing. That would be my thought. I didn't know if Jim had anything further, but that would be my thought on that.
So I just kind of want to follow up, Carolyn, with that too. So I disagree, because when money starts to become short, then the focus becomes having to address 911 issues. And then there is no effort and no energy or no money or no priority on community policing. So I think it's something really important to think about. When I was the chair of the Philip Sweden seat for 8 years, when Mayor Belton was the mayor, it was a separate component, and it was structured separately, and it was funded separately, and it was prioritized separately. And so I just think it's something to think about, because I am watching what happens as money gets taken away, and police must respond to 911 calls. And so then you lose what Commissioner Garcia is asking about, and you lose the ability to do it. And so I don't know if it can become a mandated part of a negotiated agreement or what, but I think that it needs to be protected. It needs to be protected, or we lose what we're trying to go after, which is community-oriented policing. That's it.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Metke. City Attorney, did you have a response to that, or Attorney Pashun?
I was just going to say, I again, without getting in the weeds, and we're talking about some big picture concepts to a certain extent, but I wouldn't want to mislead anyone to think that separate community-based activities that supplement, our overall public safety framework, for instance, does not necessarily bring into play collective bargaining rights for the community side of that activity. Does that make sense? You might find yourself having, let's assume for a second that you had some community-based activity that was implemented, and one of the effects of that was we are going to use X number of less officers, peace officers, as part of the force. And by the way, this is very theoretical, and you're talking about maybe some job reduction, some layoffs. Well, so the effects of that on the organized unit with the collective bargaining rights, well, that would have to be negotiated. What are the effects of reducing those jobs and eliminating them? But that does not mean that you're bargaining over the core of what that community-based activity that you have put in place is occurring. Does that help bring some clarity?
Commissioner Metke, I don't know if
Yes,
you...
thank you.
Great. Great.
It's helpful to think about, but it's interesting as far as how it plays out.
Great. So we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're rounding up to close to 6:15. We do have one last question that was presented here, and that is question number 8. What, if anything, would you offer from your professional perspective and experience that you think would be important for the Charter Commission to consider as it evaluates the current proposed amendment submitted by the City Council?
I would just say, I think the Charter Commission is, this work group seems to be doing a very good job, very thorough job. You have different speakers coming in. You had Deputy Chief Eric Forrest talk about the programs that have been going on in the Minneapolis Police Department over the past 5 years. You have brought in the correct people, and I think you're doing a great job on that. I know Commissioner Ginder at one point talked about looking at other cities, how they are funded, how they are structured, because the charter is really about structure and big picture. That might be useful for you to look at what other cities are doing and how they're set up and what kind of funding they're doing. And if they're a charter city, what does their charter look like too? So you could look at some of those issues.
Great. City Attorney or Assistant City Attorney Osborne? Any responses to that?
Madam Chairs and Commissioners, you know, I guess my my caution would be, you know, that we're looking at a charter change, and when I started working with the charter, it was a Byzantine mess, and the many years the Charter Commission and the community worked to pass the plain language charter and have it truly be, kind of set forth the structure, the bare bones structure of our city government. And so, I think the commission should just keep that in mind when it's considering, how we're going to change things, because it might be there for a long time.
Great. Thank you so much. I believe that one of our commissioners has a question. Commissioner Perry, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Hopefully this isn't the last question, because I don't want to finish up on this note, but I'm just curious if the city attorney's office was consulted in drafting the amendment that the city council proposed to us.
I can say that, Eric Nilsson was the acting director, or well, not a director, he was the interim city attorney, and I understand he was in charge at the time, so he may have been involved. Somebody had to write the language, so he may have had some involvement, but
I only asked that because we spent a good deal of time. I think there have been some great questions here, and all of you have put in a good deal of work to provide really terrific answers that I think have shined a light on some important aspects of this. So I was just curious again what your involvement was on the amendment itself, because this has been very helpful for me. I'll speak for myself. It's been very helpful for me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Perry, we are going to make that the last question for today. We appreciate you all coming to provide such great information to the commission, and it's very thorough, and we appreciate it, and you taking the time to spend part of your evening with us. Next up, we are going to continue on with the agenda with next steps, and we don't have that many next steps other than our next meeting will be a week from today, same time, and we'll have a different panel that will be focused on budget, essential staffing needs. So we'll hear from our finance leaders, we'll hear from the mayor and police chief, and also Councilmember Palmisano. So for our charter commissioners, if you have any questions, please feel free to send those over to Commissioner and Chair Rubenstein and I, and we'll get those set up for next week. Unless there are any other questions or topics that we need to discuss. Again, thank you to our panel for joining us. And with that, Commissioner Rubenstein, should we adjourn the meeting?
First, I would like to add my thanks. This has been a really helpful and productive session, and I can't thank you enough for your legal wisdom. So other than that, yes, I agree. It's time to adjourn.
Great. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Love the hot sauce.
Thank you, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tony.